This Revolution Podcast. How is everyone doing on this lovely Friday morning? This is the audio-only version of our conversation with by any means Sputnik radio host Jacqueline Luqman, who was on the show about a month or so ago, and we wanted to bring her back on. And when she was on originally, she talked about being radicalized as a leftist by being a part of the early 80s punk slash hardcore scene in DC. Very diverse scene, some might say. Gives us bands like Minor Threat, Bad Brains, Scream, which gives us Dave Grohl, who goes on to be in Nirvana. So many more. Discord Records bands, for those of you that are fans of the DC scene. But we asked the question, does music have a revolutionary capacity? In this age of hyper-capitalism, where any sort of counterculture is just sopped up, turned into a commodity, is there something about music that we can gain? Is there something we can use? That is the question we put forth. And it was a fun conversation. And it definitely got fun in the champagne room. We invited Jackie to the champagne room. She got so excited, she changed. She put on a special robe. If you want to see this, if you want to hear this, we have audio only in the champagne room as well, which was hilarious, as it usually is. There's only one way. You have to become a patron. Patreon.com/This is Revolution Podcast. I'm sorry, Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. I messed up. Sorry. But if you want to see these shows live, Tuesday through Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific time, and the Saturday free show, 9 a.m. Pacific time. And I'm giving the Pacific times because I want you guys to know how early I have to get up compared to all of my East Coast co-hosts. Everybody else outside of Kuba, it's on the damn East Coast. They talk about having breakfast and all these wonderful things they get to go do before the show. Our Saturday free show is going to be a great one. We have Dr. Michael Harris, the author of Stay Alive, using, what is that movie? Hunger Games is a grand narrative for capitalism collapse. Has a new book. We're going to discuss science fiction, what it's telling us with Toy Galaxy's Dan Larson. It's going to be a hoot. That means it's time for me to go. Leave a comment what you think about the show. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Does music have a revolutionary capacity? And I am out.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. And if you are new to the show and you have not done it already, please hit the like, please hit the subscribe button, as it does help us out. And since we're constantly adding new programming to the channel, please hit the bell so you are alerted when we go live. I want to pack as much in as possible for this hour before we head into the champagne room. So let me bring in my host, my homie, my dog. You know him as the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
I want to say I'm so glad we can keep doing all these music shows, as this brings me back to what the show originally was a show about music and politics.
It is kind of a full circle turn.
It is. I like it. I dig it. Did you watch the intro clip that I made?
Yes, I did watch the intro clip. We've been doing a lot of pop culture lately.
We have. You know why I don't mind that? It's less books for us to read.
It is less books. Sometimes it's more interesting.
But you know, so for this show, for those that don't know, I do live in Mexico, and where I live, the infrastructure isn't all that great. So if you see me disappear off the screen for a while, it means my power went out again. So my power was out for the majority of the day, and I had been doing some reading. There's some other books that we had that kind of talked about what I wanted to discuss today. Do you remember when we did the end of history with the Alpha Bunga Bunga guys, Alex Hockley? I kind of went back and looked at that book. There were some other books by Michael Harris that I kind of went back and looked at. When kind of analyzing that idea of music having some sort of revolutionary capacity, especially post 84, for my video essay, the pop politics one, and also like post part 2 of that essay that I'm still working on. Sorry, I'm so late getting it to you guys, which is the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of pop punk. Does music still have any sort of revolutionary capacity post these pivotal eras? What do you think, Pascal?
Well, I will defer to you in terms of heavy music and pop and punk. Though I do like some heavy music, I'm a little circumspect on music as the leader, the leading element of the revolution. I think it can reflect revolutionary times, but I'm a little circumspect on music as being the kind of actual spark of revolutionary capacity. But, let's bring in our guests, because I think this is going to be a good conversation, because there's a lot of left theory on this.
Yes, and I'm actually excited. I've sadly missed last time she was on. I was driving from here to Oakland, my 520-mile trek, and the reception where I was really bad, so I kept getting cut off, so I'm upset about that, so I'm ready. Many of us on the left remember the 50s and 60s and the protest anthems that were born out of that era. Songs like Give Peace a Chance and I'm Black and I'm Proud bring us back to a time of collective struggle, and music was a centerpiece of the counterculture. But what was the protest anthem of the uprisings of 2020? The Alpha Bunga Bunga guys explained in their book, The End of History, protest approximated carnival. It would overturn or destroy hierarchies, but things would return to consumerist normality the next day. Protest and dance both provided little more than a release valve. With punk evolving into the consumerist genre pop punk, hip hop becoming more and more a capitalist hymn, are our expectations too high? In this neoliberal era of the self, can music still have a revolutionary capacity? Let me bring in our guest to discuss this further. Jackie Luqman is co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, a daily show that analyzes current political and social events through an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, radical Black internationalist tradition and lens. She's also a contributor to The Real News and editor-in-chief of the social media program Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Luqman Nation. So, without any further ado, please welcome the Jackie Luqman.
What's going on? What's going on? Thank you very much for that introduction. That was great. I feel loved and special and wanted. Thank you.
Well, I hope you know by now that I have profound admiration and affection for your work and your overall presence in the current political and just overall actual space of the universe.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you, Pascal. You know I dig you. You know we rock together, and that's great. And Jason, it is great to finally meet you. This should be fun.
This is gonna be fun. So I'm gonna, let's start with a way back question. Now, you said on the show, I did hear when I was making my drive, cursing in the car, that I was constantly getting dropped on the call. That you got your political radicalization through the early hardcore movement coming out of DC. For me, a 44-year-old Oakland native, one of my huge influences musically is Bad Brains.
Man.
The only I felt the only Black group to kind of transcend, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's been others, but really when we think hardcore, definitive hardcore, kind of what people still aspire to be with the musical chops, the start, stop, it begins and ends with Bad Brains.
It does. Yeah.
So you come out of that scene in DC, which is pretty radical, like most of these scenes are, right? Because you're also coming up at the end of the Carter administration and the beginning of Reagan. So Reagan has a bigger presence in California. So of course, a lot more of the LA bands, like the ones behind me, Black Flag, at Kennedy's, are definitely more centered in local California politics, with Jello Biafra always shitting on Jerry Brown. But a lot of the music was political. So as a young Black woman, the scenes are different at this time. There is nothing to bring us all together. There's no terrestrial radio. There's no MTV. This is literally this is what's going on in my neighborhood. What brought you to this kind of white dominated genre?
My ex-boyfriend, Fred Smith. I worked with someone who was Fred's roommate. And he said to me one day, Jackie, you're real cool. You're a really nice girl. I think you'd like my roommate, Fred. I think he'd like you. You want to meet him? I'm like, yeah, sure. Okay. And he really didn't tell me anything about him, other than, he's a musician. I'm like, all right, fine. I wasn't dating anybody at the time. And, I was not that many years out of high school, maybe a year or two out of high school. And he took me to meet his roommate, Fred Freak Smith, as he later became known to be called. And oh my God, I was instantly in love. Here was this beefy Black dude with braids. No, he didn't have braids then. No, he had a Jerry curl then. Oh. He did. But he was this beefy Black dude he had motorcycle boots on, and he was just, he was gorgeous. And I was trying so hard to be nonchalant, and he was trying really hard to be nonchalant. And we're just standing there looking at each other like, hey. And he says, so you want to go to a show? And I say, yeah, sure. So, like the next Friday, he takes me to a show at Wust Hall, WUST Hall. WUST used to be a radio station here, a college radio station here in DC, and they had a ramshackle building that I don't know how it stayed up, but they had a lot of punk shows there, and that was my first introduction to punk, because I did not know at the time that Fred played guitar for Beefeater in DC. So I go into this place, it's packed full of people, and most of them were white. All of them were like kids, really young. And I'm like, what the hell has he brought me to? So then he goes and he tells me to stand here. He goes on stage, and he's the only black thing in the band. He's the only black person on stage, and they start playing, and I'm like, what the fuck is that? But he could play. He played his ass off, and that's how I got introduced to punk. I fell in love with Fred, and I dove into punk, and that's how it happened.
What kind of music did you listen to before that, though?
I actually listened to a lot of rock music, and I listened to rock and jazz and 70s funk. I really love funk music. Really, really love funk. And I think that was a reason that I really dug Beefeater, was because the bass player, and I can't remember his name right now, but the bass player was really, really good. And unlike a lot of punk bands, in Beefeater, the bass was very pronounced. So it was like, that was like their saving grace, because otherwise I was like, what's all this screaming about though, man?
It can sound like pots and pans in a dryer.
But the rhythm, it was really good. So as I got to know Fred, and I, got to learn that man really could play. He was really amazing. And then I got to, know some of the musicians in the scene here in DC, got to learn about the bands, and got involved in the very political aspect of DC punk. So that's how it happened.
Would you say that the first wave, I would call it the first wave of funk, like Sly to George Clinton, is a lot looser sonically and musically is a little freeing when you listen to it?
Yeah.
Do you think that got you ready for what would become punk music?
Yeah, that was the interesting thing, because if you dive into the funk bands that was not played a lot on commercial radio, the funk songs that were like the B-sides or whatever, you heard a lot more experimentation, like what was played on the radio in funk, and it's the same with R&B and everything else. It was very formulaic, right? Because it got played on the radio, so it was what they thought that people would like. But if you listen to like all of Sly and the Family Stone, if you listen to Bootsy Collins, if you know what I mean, if you listen to Parliament Funkadelic, if you can't listen to Maggot Brain and not have a serious respect for like this chaotic kind of musicality that doesn't sound like it would be good, but it somehow comes together in like the chaos, and it's like, it's beautiful and it's amazing. And that is very much like punk. And it's really weird because there was a band, black folks had a really hard time kind of transitioning between funk and rock. Although funk is rooted in the same
chord structure. Yeah.
It is rock. I mean, and honestly, really good metal bands, really good thrash metal bands have that really heavy bass line that you will also find in funk. That's that's why that's what drew me to early Metallica, because it's like, damn, they're funky.
Well, it's can you hit that one, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you know, if James Brown is the godfather of the one,
Mm-hmm.
when you get to George Clinton, who, you know, you can't have Clinton, I think, without, of course, James Brown, but definitely without Sly.
Right.
But as George Clinton really just assaults that one with Bootsy and those boys, like laying back and then like, What then happened? This is just my opinion. I'm sure the chat's going to blow up with your F you. You're wrong. As aesthetics become big, and Pascal, I want to know how you feel about this. We did a whole show about Rick James with now the late Greg Tate. Rick James, in my opinion, is a lot less, even though he tries to call himself punk funk, it's a lot easier to follow, and it's a lot more in line almost with like what Niles Rodgers was doing with Chic. Because they're really tight musicians, and they're not as loose. They definitely aren't playing as fast and loose, and they're definitely not even really experimenting with too many things, in my opinion. And I think the aesthetic of punk definitely is what we're doing. Like, we're gonna have the braids, and we're gonna have these big ass boots,
right?
But sonically, he fit in line with a lot of the other that next level funk guys that became kind of disco guys in the late 70s. Or do you disagree, Pascal?
I think that the distinction you're making, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think that Jason, you definitely know music more than me, and I think even Jacqueline might. So I would take the disagreement. I think that Rick James was more of an entertainer than an artist. Listen, Rick James made phenomenal music. He wrote phenomenal music. He was very creative. But I think that when I mean entertainer, I think Rick James's music was about getting the high out of the audience. He's connecting with the audience. Some of those funk bands, their art was like a cerebral thing that they were expressing their worldview. Like it was not so much for the audience. It was like, this is like my Picasso, and whether you like it or not, I don't care. Where I think Rick James was like, this is my Picasso, but I like to see y'all get off on my Picasso. So that's when I say that Rick James was a bit more of an entertainer than an artist. I'm not saying that he wasn't a good artist. He was a phenomenal artist. What I'm saying is that I think that his music was more audience driven, and that's why it fed more easily into pop culture and pop music than a lot of funk bands did.
And would you both agree that people like Clinton are coming out of the hippie movement?
Yeah,
a bit.
Yes, not
LSD
a bit.
Experimentation, you know,
Yes,
lifetime experimentation.
Yeah, that's just not a bit. Very, very much. A lot, including all of the pharmaceuticals that came with it to aid the experimentation creative process. So they say.
I mean, this, Jackie, you made a very great point in that there are funk songs that no one knows that just sound like these bands just literally just going off on themselves. Like, I'm like, what is this? Like, it's not aesthetically pleasing to most people who aren't either on like acid, PCP, or smoking 12 joints at the same time, because it's just like these cats are off. Mm-hmm. Rick James didn't really go off like that in his commercially successful periods. It's saying like when this cat made a song, when he made albums, you know, Rick James had a lot of successful albums. It's like, and it's not successful just for the artistic aesthetic. They were popular albums. And let's not get it twisted, right? Rick James' popularity comes about when there is a clear transition from Black music into a kind of conservative pop, white, MTV friendly music, right, that really kind of kills soul, R&B, and funk of the 70s. Let me tell you how I know this.
Uh-oh.
When I was literally in elementary school, right? Now I grew up in the 70s as a kid, and I'm listening to black music. My older cousin, who was like 4 years older than me, was a DJ, and there was always like black music around. I grew up in a black neighborhood, so I loved black music, right? So I went to a predominantly Catholic elementary school, but it was mostly black. It was almost all black. So I was always black music around me, right? When I go to high school, this is in '82. It's a predominantly white high school, but I'm listening for black music and black radio, and it for some reason, in like the early '80s, it becomes harder to find black music on the radio, like at that particular period, right? I remember, this is no joke. Rest in peace to James M. Tume. I used to listen to WBLS, and they used to have really interesting like political conversations about music. And James M. Tume was being interviewed on WBLS in the early 80s, and he was talking about how the transition in popular music was alienating black artists, and how this started with the disco sucks movement, and that black popular music was being alienated in mainstream America. And I didn't realize how prescient he was at the time, but I remember when MTV was not playing black music.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is,
you're
like,
right.
What is so absolutely absurd about that is that MTV, it's not that MTV wasn't playing black music, they weren't playing black people, because that was black music anyway. Rock and roll is black music.
Right.
So it's not that they weren't playing black music, they just weren't playing
Mhm.
black people.
Right. Right.
Well, there definitely was a black music blackout of what we were calling black music at that time, right? So Anita Baker, Luther Vandross, all these guys that had, major hits on quote unquote black radio, which was still being divided at that time. If we go back in the Wayback Machine, there was still black stations that wasn't playing hip hop. There was like the black R&B station, and there was a black station that played rap. So
I mean, that whole disco sucks movement, I remember that, because that happened. So for some reason, I want to say that came out of some radio station, some rock station disc jockey who was guest DJing at a baseball game somewhere. Yep. And it was some radio station promo where they dumped a bunch of disco records on the middle of the baseball field. And I can't remember what baseball game it was.
There's a YouTube of the whole thing.
So they dumped a bunch of disco records, and this was a radio station, like one of these media promos they do that doesn't mean anything. It's just meant to get attention. So out of this, where they dump all these disco records on this baseball field in the middle of this baseball game, and this DJ is ranting and raving about disco sucks. All these white baseball fans come running out onto the field, and I think they set this pile of records on fire, and somehow from that, disco became verboten on radio, and it was just like all of a sudden America doesn't like disco. But really what it was conservative America was responding to the sensuality of disco and
homosexuality.
The what?
The homosexuality. It was a lot of gay
and the fact that, oh my God, this is gay music. And Studio 54 was infamous by that time with the things that were going. So disco was like, it became like a symbol of everything that white middle Americans didn't like about the way this country was changing. So in a way, it was like a PR stunt for a radio station, but it was also part of this bigger, growing conservative kind of response to them not wanting America to change and not liking all of these others getting any kind of exposure or whatever. So yeah, these people have been wanting to take their country back for a minute.
Let's not forget, very important, I would say 800-pound gorilla in the room, it's not accidental that this is happening in the transitioning period to the rise of the Reagan administration.
Right. Exactly. Not coincidental at all. That it absolutely all are around the same time. It was the Cleveland Indians. I do remember that. And I remember watching it because I never watched baseball, but my mom and her partner were watching it, and they were like, "What the hell are these white people doing, burning shit on the field?" And I'm coming around the corner, I'm like, I'm coming to the living room, like, what? Who set stuff on fire? And they're showing it on the news, right?
And let me tell you something. This is good. I'm enjoying this conversation already because Jackie is a contemporary, so we remember things. And this is going to blow people's mind because no one talks about this, and this is a fact. No, what's one say? And because this is a fact, and only people who are old heads, like our guest at Jeremiah McAllister, will know this. I think Jackie would know this. If there's no disco, there's no hip hop. That's a fact.
Say it.
Listen, hip hop was disco for the cats who couldn't afford to go to the club. That's it.
Pretty much.
That's why crack was cocaine for the people that couldn't get for the people that couldn't get coke.
A lot of these young kids aren't going ready to hear this, but listen, disco. There's a direct correlation between the New York City disco scene and the rise of hip hop.
That's right. Because how did hip hop start? It was DJing at a party. It was DJing at a party.
Right. Block parties, and they used a lot. They innovated on, but they used a lot of the technology that was being played at the disco clubs.
That's right. Yeah.
If you want to show it, if you want to see a documentary on YouTube that talks about this, and you find the real founding fathers of rap, it's called The Founding Fathers of Rap. It's moderated by Chuck D. It's a very good documentary, and it talks about the actual origins of hip hop music
and DJ culture being about bigger systems, not so much about spinning records and scratching. Like who had a big enough system to power
sound system. Yep. And how, by the way, there's a correlation between how that comes out of like Caribbean, Jamaican shaka culture.
Just about to say that.
Yep. Shaka culture of the Caribbean. Yep. All of that. The sound system.
And I want to say on air, shout out to Jeremiah McAllister. Please email me so we can get you scheduled again to come on the show. I think we effed up on our end, so email me, brother Jeremiah, so we can make sure that we do our house music episode with you.
No doubt, there's no house music without disco. I mean, I love disco because growing up in New York City, it was like a music. I love disco. I love house music. I loved early hip hop as well too. But to see that whole disco sucks was really like whoa, like it was kind of crazy.
Like, that what show me on this record where the disco lady hurt you. I don't understand why. What happened? What the hell? Did Sylvester make you this mad? Come on,
Sylvester, who you make me feel my
oh, come on.
I know that there was a dude that came in the studio once, and he was rehearsing for a Sylvester tribute show. So he was doing that song over and over and over again. I just remember walking by the door, fucking singing and dancing. But seriously, as we go back to this moment, right? Disco, in my opinion, is the soundtrack of the era that it existed in. The me neoliberal late 70s, of course, to the early 80s, which would go on and transform it into something more with hip hop.
Well, it's really interesting. Let's see. Don't make me get conspiratorial, right?
Go for it. This is if we're going to get conspiratorial, you got 34 minutes.
From 67 to 71, there were 300 urban rebellions all over America at this time. So that means there's 300 cities between 67 and 71 that are burning to the ground. Okay. The Kerner Commission report comes out in 68, talking about like, what's going on? What is causing this? What is happening? And I know I talk about this a lot. I have the quote in the piece I wrote for Black Agenda Report on Clarence Avant talking about his rise in the early 70s. The chapter in the Kerner Commission report, the Negro in Media, where in that section, and if I have to go and read it, I'll get it. The Kerner Commission report states that basically what we have to do to make sure this doesn't happen again is that we have to have more Black people on TV. We have to have more Black journalists. We have more Black TV shows. We have to have comedies that discuss urban ghetto life, i.e. good times. We have to see more commercials with Black people. All of this is literally put in the Kerner Commission report in 1968. By then, all of a sudden, in 68, right after Kerner comes out, you see the Black Affairs TV shows, Black Journal, Tony Brown Journal, Like It Is. You see, by 71, 70, you see Soul Train. You see Good Times. But late 60s, early 70s, you see Black exploitation films. All of this capitalized Black popular cultural media out of nowhere is just dumped in the early 70s. And what is fascinating, there's 3 different changes in the nature of Black popular media, particularly on film and television, between the 40s, the late 50s and 60s, and the 70s. In the 40s, we have Step and Fetch It. We've got Mom's Mabley. We've got, Sapphire, Jezebel, and Mammy. Those characterizations of Black women. In the late 50s, early 60s, we've got the noble, striving, upright Sidney Poitier. And then in the early 70s, we've got the pimp, Superfly, Shaft, cool, smooth, cocaine, weed, let's dance, let's party, let's have a good time. Totally de-radicalized, totally apolitical. None of those media presentations demonstrate anything about the Black radical politics that starts to take place from 66 to 75. And as a matter of fact, Black exploitation is a pejorative caricature of Black power. Largely.
Right. Yeah.
So it's really fascinating how we see all of these transitions in pop culture, in music and art, and then in the 70s, all of a sudden, bam, it's like all of this explosion of Black cultural production. Now, I'm not saying Black folk were not making music before. Of course they were. But it's just like, you see Black folk on, you got Soul Train, you got Good Times. You know how many Black sitcoms there were in the early 70s? That's My Mama, Good Times. You got, the Jefferson. You see all these, you see Negroes everywhere. Black sports figures. And my position, here's the conspiracy part, is that disco and all of that stuff, as much as I love it, and all of that pop culture, was basically a capitalist-funded demobilization technique to neutralize the radical politics coming out of Black power in the late 60s, early 70s.
Now, here's my question. Kind of going off of what Pascal's talking about, Jackie. We were talking about a little bit earlier about you growing up in DC and the scene that you come out of. And when we discuss music, we have to always discuss the scene in which it exists in, the community in which it exists in. Because a lot of the music that we talk about and that we love, there are places that we know that are near and dear to our hearts. You're from DC. I'm sure you know the Black Cat and the 930 Club, like the and there's probably even more smaller spots that I've never heard of that you were like, oh, we always went to shows there on a Thursday night or whatever it is. You know, where I'm from, we definitely have our spots that were part of our scenes. And historically, New York has CBGBs and Max's, Kansas City. LA definitely had the Sunset Strip before it was a pay-to-play area. What also happened, in my opinion, with these scenes is that people that were in the scene, the fans, the promoters, the producers, everyone that was a part of it, especially with punk, because it was very DIY, tended to live in a lot of the same areas.
Yep.
Even as spread out as LA was, there were still pockets where people all kind of coalesced and lived near each other. And as we were talking earlier, you were saying that you didn't recognize the neighborhood that you met this early boyfriend. We're going to these early shows. It has a whole different look and feel. And you even mentioned that you thought that people could barely afford to live in it. And if we go back to, I believe it was 2014, 2015, when the ghost ship fire happened in Oakland, that was an artist collective. Wow. Warehouse where a lot of people lived. They threw shows, and of course it wasn't constructed well, and it burnt down. People died, and there was a huge crackdown in Oakland on warehouse parties. And recently I came to find out where I live. I moved from where I lived in the warehouse, again, in Mexico. But there was a homeless encampment, a very large homeless encampment across the street. And some cats threw a party at the homeless encampment because you can, right? And ended up setting a lot of shit on fire because they didn't handle it right. So can you talk a little bit about, because I think when we talk about the revolutionary capacity of music, I think we immediately break it down to song. Is there a song that can make you get up and rebel? I don't know if there is, but I know there's a moment in time where people feel collectivized. And I want to hear about that, not just that first punk rock boyfriend that turned you into the genre, but I want to hear about the scene you were a part of, the feeling when you got into your first mosh pit or slam dance, whatever they were calling it, skanking. I don't know. Everybody's era is different. But I have a feeling that if I go watch some of these old Bad Brains videos, we might be able to catch Jacqueline Luqman jumping off of a stage somewhere.
You will never catch footage of the time. At the time, I was Jacqueline Malone. There is no footage of me doing anything, anywhere. Whew, thank the Lord I did all my crazy stuff before cell phone video. and it's not like I'm like weirded out about any of that stuff, but you know, I turned into a pretty heavy drinker back then. So there were some things I am thankful that I didn't. I see people in the street sometime and they're like, Jackie, remember when we used to hang out at that? And I'm running through my mind like, oh my God, what I hope it wasn't that night. But I mean, the scene then, it was interesting because DC is not that big. First of all, people have to understand Washington, DC is not a big city. It's divided into 4 quadrants. It is each quadrant, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, have very separate characters, or always have. Northwest was always like where all of the rich people lived, most of the white people lived. Northeast, you have more Black people, but some professional. Southeast and some parts of Northeast. And back then, a lot of Southwest. DC was predominantly Black, and it was predominantly working class and poor. So at that time, during the Reagan years, the end of the Carter years, and the rise of the Reagan years, poor people were really, really feeling the economic policies that were coming out of the Reagan administration. I mean, people liked Jimmy Carter because he was nice, right? But people really started to feel like what politics mean for their life because of Ronald Reagan. And you had people who were working class white folks who were in the city feeling that squeeze, but you had a large population of working class and poor Black people who were feeling that squeeze. So that showed up in different places, in 2 different scenes that actually kind of came together very frequently. And one scene was the go-go scene. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of early go-go was actually very political. Like one of the first go-go songs I ever heard was by Junkyard Band. And when they recorded this song, they were like kids. They were like somewhere between 12 and maybe 16 years old. And they recorded this song called The Word, which was really, I don't know if I would call it a protest song, but it was absolutely it was a condemnation of the Reagan administration. I mean, some of the lines in the song are, you know, like, Reagan did away with the welfare money, or the Pentagon did away with Farmer Brown's money, that kind of stuff. And these were kids living in the hood, literal kids. So there was that going on. But go-go also was mostly like party music, like hip hop started out. But you did have those pockets of like musical resistance from people who were feeling the effects of the shitty economic policies from the Reagan administration. And you could see it in the way that they started their bands, because the reason Junkyard Band was called Junkyard because they used like buckets and shit. I'm serious. They used like buckets and whatever they could find, and they called themselves the Junkyard Band because they didn't have money for real instruments. So there was that going on in the poor Black communities, right? And then in the punk community, there was the realization that DC, which felt like a really kind of home, down home, close-knit community sometimes, and in some places, started to feel like an authoritarian state. There started to be a clear disdain for poor people, where maybe it was there before, but the Reagan era absolutely gave rise to that greed is good. If you're poor, then you're the scourge of society type of thing. And a lot of white kids noticed that. And the reason they noticed it, because they noticed it in their parents. Right? So you had a lot of kids who were either working class white kids, or some of them were white kids from wealthy families who did not like the way they saw their parents, their neighbors acting. So in response to the kind of the very flashy kind of pop music that was being pushed, and the very capitalist, money focused entertainment that was out there, punk was born kind of out of that in DC, and a particular type of punk music, a very politicized punk music that took on these issues of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of war, and criticizing the Reagan administration. So the way these two disparate groups of affected youth came together was in a place called the 930 Club. Interestingly enough, because the 930 Club was one of the few places in DC where you could see a go-go show, and it was pretty safe. I used to take my junior high school age cousin to the go-go shows at the 930 Club. And there was an issue with violence at some of the go-go shows at some places like the Colorama Room and some of the clubs that used to be on 16th Street. Because this kind of happened at the same time the crack epidemic happened.
Gotcha.
So so then the city started cracking down on go-go clubs, but the 930 Club was a safe place for go-go bands to play, and they had all the go-go bands. But the 930 would do a really cool thing. And my ex-boyfriend actually worked at the 930 Club too. They would do a really cool thing. They would have a Saturday show with like an 8 bill with 4 go-go bands and 4 punk bands. So you would have kids from Northeast, Black kids from Northeast and Southeast packed into the 930 Club with white kids from Rockville and Gaithersburg and the outlying suburbs and Northwest DC, all packed into the 930 Club, all jamming, all vibing together. And that was the scene. That was the scene. And it was like my first introduction, I think, to the idea of a society better than what we have. It's like, we can build something better. We have the capacity to do something better than what we do. And if we can do it with music, I don't understand why we can't do with anything else. And I didn't understand the concepts of socialism and communism and, all that. I didn't even really understand capitalism then, but I understood that that was the only place where I saw punks and go-go kids hanging out together, having a great time, and coming to each other's defense, because we did have a little problem with racist skinheads, and that shit got squashed really quick.
And that seems to be kind of a through line in all these scenes, that a lot of people were fighting skinheads. But that first wave of punk, which I'll have to send it to you. I don't know. I'm sure Pascal didn't. The video essay I do kind of says the aesthetic that we have for your scene of hardcore comes from the Sex Pistols version of what punk is, which comes from Malcolm McLaren being a part of the Situationist International and being all about spectacle. And that's why you have guys wearing Nazi swastikas, British guys wearing swastikas and thinking it's cool. And it's more a fashion aesthetic than it is kind of a belief system for a lot of the people. I won't say for all, for a lot of the people. But there is a vibe of community, and there is a vibe of collective struggle. Right. In everything that's going on. My question is, what happens to that movement, that scene, that era, and the collective struggle changes, the vibe changes, and at best, we get a lot of these bands that are just kind of cliche, especially by the time we get to the early 90s.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of echo the sentiment that Jackie had, not in terms of that type of music, but the place where and Jeremiah is talking about it in the chat, the place where I felt that kind of multiracial, we're all in this together, we have a kind of like utopian moment socio-politically, was house music, in the house music scene in New York in the late 80s. And it was just like, you see, black, white, straight, gay, whatever. And house music really had, and a lot of it was, I wouldn't say house music was political. Some of the music had political, more like social, let's all get together. We can, there was some of the stuff out of some of the stuff out of Jersey had some kind of, kind of like racial unity kind of vibe to it, but it was a very kind of utopian, let's all get together and like vibe that was very rare, and it was very enjoyable for a brief little moment in time.
But the 90s has another we're also talking about the emergence of techno music, which we can definitely throw in with house music, and which kind of morphs into rave culture. And again, rave culture is supposed to be this collective experience, but is it anything more than just a release? And if you look at kind of activism in this era as well, it goes from being, especially after the defeat of Bush Sr. And by the time the Clinton administration comes into power, a lot of a lot of what we see is less pushback against the government, because allegedly the good guy won, right? We had 12 years of right-wing authoritarian rule. Bill Clinton's playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall. Toni Morrison says he's the first black president. He's one of us. So what then happens to the struggle? Because in a lot of the research that I've been doing for part 2 of this essay, and even just remembering this era, and I brought this up on a show the other day, during this era as well, even cartoons change their mode to be, because the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union's fallen. G.I. Joe stops, the Cobra's fighting is different. Now they're fighting the environment.
Right.
And we start to get this push of the individual, that you can be a better human if you recycle.
Yep.
And our real problem is no longer the big bad Russians and their nuclear missiles. It's corporations and polluting.
It's neoliberalism. I mean, it's neoliberalism. It's third way. It's the third way. Or what was the name of that organization that pushed the whole third way?
DLC, Democratic Leadership.
Thank you, the Democratic Leadership Council. It's. I mean, they sold the country a bill of goods, and they knew what they were doing. Because they knew that people have been raked over the coals through the Reagan era. And the thing that happened, the interesting thing, that's why that whole, and I remember watching the inauguration of Bill Clinton when they walk over the bridge and the bridge lights up and they're playing Don't Stop, Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. And I remember, and I wasn't.
I remember that.
Clintons, man. Let me tell you, you know one of my proudest political achievements? It's not an achievement. I shouldn't say that. You know one of my proudest political facts of my life is?
What?
I never voted for a Clinton in my life.
I didn't either. Good for you. Good for you. Was I old? Yeah, I think I was old enough to vote but I don't remember. I don't think I voted for Clinton, but I don't remember who I voted for because I think I made up my mind I didn't like any of them. So I probably wrote it. But I remember watching that inauguration and saying to either my mom or my boyfriend at the time, this is some hokey ass theater. I don't know what these people are trying to say, but I don't think things are going to go because in Black neighborhoods, the police were cracking down on everybody, not just the violent criminals that they were cracking down on everybody, and that was spilling over into the punk community. And I knew plenty of folks who had substance abuse problems in the punk community. And this is the way we had community. I knew 4 or 5 people who had a heroin habit. But we had rules. You could not rob anybody in the community. You couldn't steal from anybody in the community. You had to work, so everybody I knew who had a habit had a job, and it was just. But then all of a sudden people are getting arrested and, but nobody's getting treatment. Nobody's getting the help they need. Right. So what happens is, at least from what I saw, it's like the country felt like they didn't need to be angry anymore because they got rid of Reagan. Right. So the music didn't need to reflect the anger and the anti-establishment sentiment and the anger at authority that punk and go-go reflected. And it just turned to this generalized kind of teenage angst that was grunge.
Grunge is just remarketed, in my opinion. It's remarketed hardcore.
Yeah, and a lot of it wasn't even good.
I like some grunge now. Don't be. Come on.
I won't. We could waste a lot of time, talking about. I was not a fan of. So more so than punk, and I never really talk about it that much because I don't think it's a very political music. Regardless of my friends that do it, I don't give a fuck. I'll tell them to their face you guys aren't really that political. Is metal. I'm a metal guy. I'm a serious fucking metal guy. Mm-hmm. But that music was definitely not. they might think they have songs that are political, but it's
not really. I mean,
kind of I liked Nirvana. I liked Green Day. I liked Is REM considered grunge? Is that offensive to call REM grunge?
REM would be quote unquote alternative.
That's extremely offensive.
Well, the thing is, I liked alternative and grunge. I like kind of both.
I mean, and here's the thing. For me, because I understand that all entertainment is political. I understand that now. Back then, it was just what I like and what I don't like, right? Yeah. And as I became more political, I did like more political messaging. Like when Metallica came out with "And Justice for All," I was like, wow, this is actually kind of thoughtful. It's a little bit, that's kind of nice. And people were like, oh, this is trash. I'm like, well, you don't have a brain, so that's why you don't like it, but I mean, I think that for grunge, the message, the political message, if you will, was just, rebellion. And that's fine.
Yes. Very
I think that's
rebellion.
fine. I think that's absolutely fine. I think that is a valid political message, but it's not the same political message that was very specific as a lot of punk and a lot of go-go was.
I also
that's
think
not bad. I think that's just an observation.
And do you think that it exists in a different vacuum that maybe that punk existed in? Because you're also talking about localized scenes. And grunge, which to me is more of a fashion aesthetic than the genre, is an MTV corporate phenomenon.
Yes.
Because Nirvana does not sound like Alice in Chains, who doesn't sound like Pearl Jam, who doesn't sound like Mother Love Bone, doesn't sound like Tad, who doesn't sound like the Melvins.
And I love some Alice in Chains, man.
Some of the best riffs, Jerry Cantrell. And I'll tell you an off-air story about Alice in Chains that I cannot tell on air.
Okay.
But
and Nirvana is a good point, though, because people need to understand Nirvana comes from the DC punk scene. Dave Grohl is from DC.
Yeah.
He was the drummer for Fugazi. And I'm thinking of Scream too.
Scream, he was in Scream.
Yeah. And I wonder what happened to Scooter. I gotta find out what happened. But like Scooter was Scooter was like the other black guy in the punk scene, the other black musician in the punk scene, other than Betty, the black lady who is the singer for Betty, which is not really a punk band, but they started in the DC punk scene also. But the Foo Fighters, The Foo Fighters came from Nirvana, came from Fugazi, came from Scream, came from the DC punk scene. And none of those bands sound anything like each other.
No.
So,
there's no sonic through line that you get from hardcore and punk with grunge. And I think grunge again is a fashion aesthetic. It's definitely the naming of it is all corporate. And I think sadly the bigger artists of the day, and I don't think they're bad people by any stretch of the imagination. Some of these people I do know personally. They got co-opted. They walked into the door getting co-opted. I'm going to call it something different. I can sell rebellion to the youth, and now rebellion is an aesthetic, and it's not centralized like this other music was with scenes. So the reason why I go back and mention what happened to punk in the 90s is because the decline of Western civilization set of movies, the first one is, LA hardcore in 81. The second one's kind of a tongue-in-cheek take on hair metal in the mid 80s. The last one that doesn't get a theatrical release, she tries to go back to punk, and it's kind of dead in LA. She has to go all the way out to the Imperial Valley, or the Inland Empire, I'm sorry, to the Riverside area, Corona, at a place called the Showcase Theater. And she shows a punk show where, they're singing about all the shit that punks sing about, but it also comes off a bit cliche to the point where she stops covering the bands. All the other movies, it's all about bands. We'll throw some bands in there. Interesting. The third movie, she actually follows, for the majority of the film, a bunch of unhoused, what we would call gutter punks. And what was two of them end up getting a house for a month. Yeah. And they let the whole crew live in it.
Yeah.
And they fuck it up. It's everything you would think that gutter punks would do, but you get that communal vibe. You understand where everything is coming from, right? But it almost feels like that's now compartmentalized to, okay, you guys are over there. You guys are gutter punks. And this is the music that you listen to. This is the thing that you do. This is grunge. This is hardcore. This is metal. We all live in our little box. And without MTV, without terrestrial radio, now we live in echo chambers of the wretched algorithm.
Yeah.
So before I let you answer, as we come up on an hour, will you join us to continue this conversation for a little bit longer in the champagne room?
Oh, there's a champagne room?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do I have to put on my fancy robe? Oh my!
Only if it's got fur on it.
Oh my stars! I mean, because I have a fancy robe. I feel like I've been invited to a special. Why, yes, I will join you in the champagne room.
You have the link for the champagne room.
The champagne room is where we're behind a paywall, so curse words can fly.
Sweet. Fancy robe and cuss words.
So I want to hear Jackie talk about after the 80s and that scene, because that to me is an important thing to talk about. So
Ooh,
if you are a patron,
a weird time.
if you're a patron, the link is already up for the champagne room. We will join you guys shortly. If you're not a patron, it's patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. There's links wherever you're watching this show in the description to join us in the champagne room. Until then,
Ooh.
please listen to where'd it go? Music I created for my 3-year-old son and images of the capitalist realism of my youth. Thank you, and we are out.